Hello and welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio here on the Big Talker 106.7 FM and Sauga 960 AM in the Peel region, Ontario, Canada. We are very blessed today to be speaking with none other than Jeffrey Brandes. He is an American politician who is serving as a Florida state senator from the 24th District. That is St. Petersburg, Florida. He is a second-time guest now on Consumer Choice Radio. Senator Brandes, thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be with you.
So there's a lot of stuff we've been hearing in the news about Florida. There's a lot of our Canadian listeners up north are a bit sad that they're not able to be snowbirds right now, not able to travel. They have their own restrictions. We're hearing about travel restrictions from other states, or even Joe Biden coming down on this. Tell us, why is everyone looking down so sourly at Florida when Florida seems to be doing pretty great when it comes to COVID and vaccinations?
Well, I think, our governor took a very different tack than what you've seen governors from New York or California or other states around the country. Really, he's been focused on keeping people employed, keeping businesses open, and keeping kids in school. We know that the learning gains that these kids are getting on virtual school are nowhere near what they're going to get while they're in school. And so I think his tact has been he's an outlier in the country, but I think it's a positive outlier overwhelmingly. I think if you look at our COVID numbers, they are substantially better than California's, substantially better than New York's. And we're now in the process of vaccinating. I think we've vaccinated well over 1 million seniors at this point. And we're working hard to grow that number every day.
Yeah, it's a pressing topic here in Canada because obviously you would know there are, I don't even know what the number is, but it's in the hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 1 million, I don't know, snowbirds who make the annual trek down to Florida to enjoy the nice weather. I know that my grandparents, when they were alive, were part of that proud cohort of Canadians. So a lot of talk about vaccinations and Florida. And I know that there've been some people who have dual citizenship kind of kicking the tires, basically saying, okay, well, do we go to Florida for a longer period than we maybe would have otherwise? Because this seems to be a state that is figuring out its vaccination process and things like that. But beyond COVID, I did want to, you mentioned schools, and this isn't something that Yael and I have gotten too deep on, but what is the relationship, or what has that process been like with the teachers' unions in Florida? And I asked this question because I know there are some really wild examples elsewhere in the country where the teachers union pushed for teachers to be at the front of the line for vaccinations, which I think you can make a decent argument for, but then didn't want to return to the classroom or didn't want to have in-person learning.
Yeah, so early on, the governor and the commissioner of education here in Florida decided that they were going to do everything they could to give parents options, but the option had to include in-person learning. And so they laid down the gauntlet early on that no matter what happened, the schools were going to be back open. Now, it was up to parents to determine whether they wanted to send their kids back to school, but they had to have that choice. And so while you've seen a lot of these conversations in other states occur, you really haven't seen that in Florida, because early on, it was very clear that schools must reopen and accept students who wanted to go back to school.
Yeah, and definitely the governor has been very strong on this. I know he came out with a couple of tweets earlier in the week, sort of going line by line of the various policies that Florida has taken and why it is actually a leader. And definitely, I think we would agree with that. Just from our own lockdown states, countries, and cities, it's just a marvel to look at, and really, it's amazing to see.
Well, if you want to eat in a restaurant, you can come to Florida. So that's why people are leaving, New York in droves, Connecticut in droves, California in droves, because they're recognizing that their lives are significantly impacted. Their kids, if you think about the learning loss that we're going to see over the last year for many of these kids who are trying to do online learning, but that's not the way they learn best. And they're missing out on the human interaction, which is so important. Yeah, education is critical at schools, but we learn so many other skills by sending our kids to school beyond just the education component. And so to me, the governor that's a huge win. Probably the best thing that he did was keep the schools open, keep kids going back, giving parents the option to send their kids back to school. because I think you're going to see really a profound learning loss in much of the country.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Definitely true in places like Chicago and Los Angeles and New York, where they're having these battles again. So yeah, something that we'll definitely try to keep attuned to, and Florida really is providing us with another example. I wanted to go through the list of some of the other topics. By the way, David, you can, if you want to chime in on the education thing.
I just had one. I don't know if there's any truth to it, but I know that there were some original rumors that some major Wall Street firms and hedge funds and basically financial centers were looking at Miami as a possible relocation, just to say, okay, well, enough of New York, whether it be taxes or restrictions. I mean, outside of COVID, but almost like a major realignment in American finance, where you're starting to see these big firms who are traditionally in Manhattan say, okay, maybe it's time we shift gears and move to the Sunshine State. I don't know if that's happened or if you are.
It's happening every day. Florida is a state with 22 million people. We're growing by about 800 people a day. We expect to be around 26 million people by the end of the decade. So I don't know, other states are growing at 25% over the next decade, but Florida's really looking at that type of number, 20 to 25% growth. And that creates obviously an incredible strain on the resources to grow at that pace. But I think it's exciting, and people are, they vote with their feet. At the end of the day, people look at their tax bills in New York and they look at the budget deficits of some of these states, and they know who they're going to hit hardest. And so they're voting with their feet. And yeah, we're starting to see investment banks and hedge funds, and I mean, to the point where it's starting to affect the economies of other states, because they've relied on the income from those hedge fund managers and the tax revenue from those hedge fund managers to backfill their budgets. And now we're seeing those people moving to Florida and getting and establishing their families here, and it's having a real impact on those other states because Florida doesn't tax income. We don't have a state income tax. And our education is consistently getting better. We have more in our schools than any other state in the country. And we're really proud of and continuing to thrive on.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm still a proud Florida tax resident. So thank you for that. A couple other things. We're speaking with Florida State Senator Jeffrey Brandes. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeffrey Brandes. Some of the other issues that you'll be discussing or hopefully trying to pass in the legislative session up there in Tallahassee, we have the COVID Liability Shield, very important for schools and businesses. We have bills on alcohol modernization, near and dear to both of our hearts, adult use and medical cannabis. You had some on Fourth Amendment protections on electronic devices, legalizing sports betting, finally, and also peer-to-peer car sharing. So I know that you've got some important topics for consumer choice, obviously things that we really believe in. But I wanted to get to the liability shield. I think COVID is still a huge reality. Why is a liability shield something important that the state legislature should take up?
Yeah, so for all of Florida's wonderful benefits, we're considered, unfortunately, a judicial hellhole. The amount of litigation down here is obscene. And what we're seeing, what we're afraid of, is what we call sue and settle lawsuits, where somebody says, I caught COVID at your business. Unless you pay me $10,000, I'm going to take you to court. And it's going to cost you 50, 100, your entire business. We don't know. And so what we're trying to end is these frivolous lawsuits that could come because somebody says, well, I went into the local grocery store and got COVID, or I went to the local dry cleaner or pizza shop. And because of because what you did, back in March or April, I got COVID. And we have to think about, our nursing homes and hospitals and other healthcare organizations. I mean, these are essential businesses that we required to stay open. We required them to keep their residents there. Unfortunately, from March until July, really, PPE was not, personal protective equipment was not readily available, to the point where, you would see pictures of people in nursing homes wearing a trash bag, a shower cap, and a homemade mask. And we basically asked them to MacGyver their way through a global pandemic. And so we have to, they were there for us. They were there for our residents. Yes, unfortunately, some people got COVID inside these nursing homes and hospitals. But frankly, at least in the hospitals, that's where we were sending people with COVID. So we should expect that it's going to be there. The key is they were there for us. We need to be there for them now. And I liken it back to, look, the Florida Senate probably has some of the most extreme anti-COVID measures in the country. And every week for the last 6 weeks, one of our members has come down with COVID, of the 40 of us. And so we can't keep it out of the Florida Senate. How are hospitals who are sending people with COVID there, nursing homes that have to provide for their residents and have people coming in and out as workers and healthcare providers, how, especially when, if you think about early on, look, a COVID test early on was a thermometer pressed against your head, which is a crude tool at best for asymptomatic people.
And so what would the threshold, I guess, in theory be if a business was in good faith trying to follow the public health guidelines that are passed down from the state and whatever the rules and restrictions are, whether they were capacity requirements at a restaurant or what have you, if they were making a good faith effort to try and meet the criteria from public health officials, that is the standard in which should...
Yeah. So that's correct. So we would provide them safe harbor from litigation. The standard in Florida, or at least in our piece of legislation, is gross negligence. So unless they purposefully, for example, if they had an employee they knew had COVID, they asked him to come back to work knowing that he had COVID and he infected people around him, that would be considered gross negligence, not somebody who left the salt shaker on the table instead of picking all the salt shakers up, which we considered simple negligence. To me, that's where you could see the rash of the lawsuits. I think setting that higher standard, and we've also moved it to a clear and convincing standard. So it's not just a preponderance of the evidence. It has to be, you have to clearly show that they committed gross negligence.
Yeah, that's a big one, and surely, hopefully, we'll stop a lot of the frivolous lawsuits, because I'm sure the courts will be plenty. Again, another judicial hellhole there in Florida. So thank you so much for working on that. Looking at the other issues that we mentioned, I know there's a lot. I know that I believe she's the Secretary of Agriculture. I forget the title. Forget her name, but I know she's big on cannabis and discussing cannabis and figuring out a way to perhaps legalize in Florida. Obviously, we have Congressman Matt Gaetz, who's also discussed it positively. I know that at least back when I was in Florida, living there full time, this is not the top of the sheet issue, but it seems that things are changing now. So how does it stand now in Florida on legislation related to cannabis, medical and otherwise?
So there's a constitutional amendment that is gathering signatures. They had a hearing before the Florida Supreme Court back in May of last year. We're waiting for that opinion to be released. Once it's released, it should be released really any day. And we're waiting for that opinion to be released. Once it's released, I think if it says they can continue to gather signatures, and if they get the requisite amount of signatures that question is going to go on the ballot, I think it's overwhelmingly likely to pass. The polling that we're seeing just shows that it's probably going to get in the mid 60s, and it requires 60% to pass in Florida. So I think it's not a question of if it's going to happen. It's a question of when and how it's going to happen. So my issue is that I think the legislature should handle this issue. We should keep it in the legislative framework. That way we can come back and address it over time versus having to run a constitutional amendment in the future. So that's why I propose our legislation. I think our legislation will gain a lot of steam once the inevitability of people of this constitutional amendment getting on the ballot is realized, because I think that's when the real negotiations will start in earnest.
And just for our listeners, so that they know, in case they weren't with us the last time you were on the show, so you are a Republican. Are you seeing other Republicans come around to this? And are you seeing opposition on both sides, to the Democrat and Republican side? Or could we actually maybe, fingers crossed, see some sort of bipartisan agreement that this is the way Florida needs to go?
It's going to be a bipartisan agreement. You really need bipartisan agreement to get to 60% in Florida. So I think you're going to see our piece of legislation is a bipartisan piece of legislation. And I think it's really kind of older Republicans versus younger Republicans as it relates to cannabis adult use. And I think most of the younger Republicans that I speak to are much more libertarian in their thinking on this topic. And I think that they're going to be supportive of it. And so I think as we move forward here, once this constitutional amendment issue gets resolved and they start gathering signatures again, I think the whole mindset of the Florida legislature is going to change, largely because they don't know who's going to come out if this thing gets on the ballot, and how that changes the dynamics. If you take, the fact that it will be on the ballot, on the fact that essentially everybody's running because we just had a census and we're going to redraw all the lines in 2022. And so that kind of tends to make people nervous. Let's take one of those issues off the conversation and address it in the legislature. That's at least my pitch to my Republican colleagues. And I think we're starting to see some of that ice break, and they're kind of beginning to wrap their arms around why I filed it and why this is the right way to go.
Now,
Awesome,
I wanted to hop into sports very quickly. Obviously, we just had the Super Bowl and just had the Daytona 500, which I obviously followed. And it seems as if sports are on the up and up in Florida. It's the place to go. Hopefully we can get some Formula E back in St. Pete. I think that'd be pretty cool. But sports betting is another one of the bills that you've sponsored. And obviously, if many of our listeners don't know, the Supreme Court has allowed some kind of sports betting to happen. It seems it's up to every state to put forward the guidelines and the rules. What is the state of that in Florida? And hopefully, what would your bill allow us to do? Does that mean I can finally beat David in a couple of sports bets?
Well, I think the key thing in Florida is we basically don't enforce the laws on the books as it relates to sports betting online today. And so whether you're doing FanDuel or any of the other websites that are out there, to my knowledge, 0 people have been prosecuted in Florida for betting online. So if we recognize that the handle on the Super Bowl was something like $7 billion, of which a significant portion of that was probably bet in Florida online on these platforms. And, Florida could participate in that. My proposal is run it through the lottery, contract it out, get those providers to come in and let the lottery be the regulatory body. This is a bunch of states are doing it like this now, and continue to grow the market, which is already out there, which is already kind of well established and on online sports betting. But, there's no reason that should be illegal in Florida, especially if we're not going to enforce the laws on the books today.
That's quite a movement there that we have in Florida, and it's being led by State Senator Jeffrey Brandes. Thank you so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio. We'll be checking in with you a lot more. Best of luck in all of your endeavors up there in Tallahassee.
Thanks. We'll talk soon.